Well, first of all, today is, of course, a very sad and solemn day for us, a commemoration of the worst day in Israel's history.
Ground invasion to Gaza, showing that Israel is not afraid to actually use boots on the ground in order to regain its, not only its hostages, its territory, but also its sense of security and deterrence.
Israel has developed a very robust bilateral relationships with countries like China, India, Singapore, but lately there has been a considerable growth in the ties, particularly in the defense sector, with some of these Southeast Asian countries, particularly the Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam, and Myanmar. We can see that there are some sort of a military security cooperation.
Hamas, Islamic Jihad, have embedded themselves within the structure, the infrastructure of Gaza, and therefore the question is, how, if you wish to fight them, how do you extract them? And this is very much a moral dilemma.
Relations between India and Israel are strategic. Both countries are collaborating on a wide range of sectors, including defense and security. What is important to understand is that both countries started to collaborate on these sectors way before they normalized their relations in 1992.
Greetings, everyone. This is Anirban Datta. Today, we welcome you to our premier panel discussion series, Israel's Gaza War, Strategic Dilemma or a Tactical Disaster. As we mark 1 year since Hamas's largest attack against Israel, the ever-evolving conflict is no longer limited only to Israel or Gaza. It has affected every aspect of regional geopolitics in the Middle East, as we further reflect on the deadliest day in Israel's history. Therefore, to understand the implications of the conflict, we have with us Dr. Chuck Freilich, who is a senior researcher at the Institute of National Security Studies at Tel Aviv University. We have Dr. Tomer Persico, who is serving as a Rubenstein Fellow at the Reichman University. We are delighted to have Dr. Alvite Singh Ningthoujam, who is an assistant professor at the Symbiosis School of International Studies, Pune. We're delighted to have Ms. Nina Slama, who is serving as an India's foreign policy expert at the Reichman University. And last but not the least, we have Dr. Colin Shindler, who is an Emeritus professor at the Center for Jewish Studies in SOAS University of London. So it is great to have you all with us in today's panel. So to discuss about the latest conflict, we have come across the complexities in Israel's national security strategy and in providing a bit of a deep insight to it. So my first question will be directed to Dr. Chuck Freilich. Could you elaborate on the fundamental shifts in Israel's strategic thinking and national defense architecture since the October 7 attacks?
Well, first of all, today is, of course, a very sad and solemn day for us, a commemoration of the worst day in Israel's history. And there is no doubt that the failures of October 7th, which I'm happy to say today are beginning to have been turned around and to look increasingly like a success from Israel's point of view, at least militarily, there's no doubt that this will require some rethinking of Israel's national security strategy. I think the big question is whether it was a failure of specific policies in the years before the war, or it goes beyond that and requires fundamental changes to the national security strategy per se. And it's probably a mix of the two. I think mostly the former. You know, there were a number of assumptions that had guided Israel's policies in the previous years. For example, that Hamas could be bought off, so to speak, and that Israel could gain calm and military quiet in exchange for economic growth. That Israel could go ahead with what seemed imminent and groundbreaking regional transformation with the Saudis and others, while ignoring the Palestinian issue from a political perspective. That Gaza and the West Bank could be separated politically on an ongoing basis. These and others were assumptions that were clearly flawed, and for which I believe the political leadership bears full responsibility. The military leadership, of course, bears responsibility for the actual military failures. I think fundamentally Israel's national security strategy was and remains sound, but there are some items or some of the tenets of the strategy that we will have to look at again. One of the central ones was always that Israel fights its wars alone, does not ask for foreign powers for assistance other than weapons. Well, that's not quite true. This war has required extensive cooperation between Israel and the US, even against what was thought to be Israel's weakest adversary, Hamas. And it looks like we're going to have to fight increasingly in, at least partially, in multilateral frameworks, because we've seen that in the case of the 2 Iranian missile attacks against Israel in April and just a week ago, we worked with a coalition of the US, France, Britain, a number of Arab countries, and some others. So that will be one of the big changes that will have to happen.
To be honest enough, we have actually come across Hamas's led attacks and the security operations, and this particular question is directed to Dr. Toomer. Given the Hamas's led attacks and the security operations which has been launched by Israel in response to it, it has faced a significant degree of backlash, especially if we consider it from the prism of ethics and international humanitarian law and humanitarian challenges. So under such a context, what exactly are the alternative defense and diplomatic strategies that Israel can adopt for being a victim of terrorism?
Thank you. Let's look closely about that backlash. There is backlash, or there was backlash from the 8th of October from the more radical left-wing sides of politics, certainly in the US, also in Europe. But there was great support for Israel from the leaders of what is called the free world, the democratic world, from the US, from Europe. We might forget that in the first few months of the war, not only Biden visited Israel during a war, president of the US, but also Macron and Schulz, the leader of Germany, and Sunak, who was then Prime Minister of Britain. So Israel was very much supported in those first few months of the war, and I think those first few months were almost inevitable. I mean, the strategy or the tactics that Israel initiated were almost inevitable, meaning, of course, retaliation towards Gaza and even ground invasion to Gaza, showing that Israel is not afraid to actually use boots on the ground in order to regain its, not only its hostages, its territory, but also its sense of security and deterrence. So those few months had a lot of backing for Israel. But what happened is that approximately in January this year, Israel was offered an out-ramp, a way out of the war that included a regional deal that had some sort of normalization with Saudi Arabia for Israel, that had the return of the hostages, of course, on the side of Hamas, if they would have agreed, and some sort of pan-Arabian or international body coming into Gaza and taking control on its way to the control being handed over to the Palestinian Authority, and a sort of a horizon of a Palestinian state in a few years. That was approximately the bylines of that deal. And what happened is that Israel rejected it. Israel rejected it because our current Prime Minister Netanyahu cannot allow himself to even say that he is in some way positive towards a solution of a two-state solution for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And since that time, Israel has been waging that war. I mean, you can say from the beginning, but it was clear from that time that Israel is waging this war without any strategy, without any end game that could be articulated, not only for the world, but even for Israeli citizens. What are we doing in Gaza now? Is Hamas beat or not? If he is, what are we still doing there? Or what's the future? What are the prospects? More right-wing religious fundamentalist minister in our governments think that we are going to settle Gaza, to build settlements in Gaza, Jewish settlements in Gaza. Others are saying we should simply run the population out, sort of make all of them refugees in Egypt. So these are, of course, crazy ideas, completely crazy ideas, but they are floated around since our prime minister has said nothing about the end goal of the war. So I would say Israel has been meandering in this war since about January, February of this year, when this regional deal was rejected and no alternative strategy was put forward.
So that is an interesting insight when we consider about Israel's diplomatic strategy and the governance surrounding it. So my next questions will be directed to Dr. Alvite. There has been a significant degree of exports of Israeli defense export to Southeast Asia and the Asian nations in general in recent years. So in that context, like, while this military partnerships and security sharing is crucial for both the sides, like, what will be the implications for the bilateral defense ties with the Southeast Asian nations if the current conflict and the situation worsens further?
Right. Thank you, Anirban, for that question to me. I also express my gratitude to GEOSTRATA for having me this evening to discuss this very important topic on the emerging dynamics of geopolitics in West Asia, particularly, or Middle East, particularly emerging out of the conflict that began exactly 1 year ago. All of us have seen, particularly the students of Middle East, or particularly the Israeli foreign policy, an uptick in the relations between Israel and some of the Asian countries, let alone Southeast Asia. There has been a tremendous rise in the nature of cooperation between Israel and some of the economies in the Asian region. That includes not only the Southeast Asian countries, but also India. China has been one of the the biggest partners for Israel for the longest time. But coming to your very pointed question with regard to the defense partnerships with the Southeast Asian countries, I must say that it's been a little more than a decade that Israel has developed a very robust bilateral relationships with countries like China, India, Singapore. But lately, there has been a considerable growth in the ties, particularly in the defense sector, with some of these Southeast Asian countries, particularly the Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam, and Myanmar. We can see that there are some sort of a military security cooperation, not only in the form of arms trade, where Israel defense industries have a very important presence in some of these countries, but also looking into building up more technological transfer and license production in some of the key areas of defense sector. So we have seen this trend in the last few years, and whenever you see the reports being released by the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI, you can see how much the Israeli defense firms account for some of these arms exports to this country that I just mentioned. Some of the most sought after defense items purchased by the Southeast Asian countries are mostly in the categories of arms and ammunition, UAVs, and various other counterterrorism law enforcement items. You can see when you see, if you're someone who looks into the trade figure of bilateral trade between Israel and some of the Southeast Asia, dominate quite a big chunk of Israel's arms exports to these countries. When we look at the current scenario right now, it's very fascinating that this particular conflict that began exactly 1 year ago had come about at a time when Israel's diplomatic and political recognition and acceptance are on the rise. Not only in the Middle East, but also in other parts of the world. And if you see the reactions coming from the larger Asian countries or the wider Asian countries, it has been not as severe as it used to be in the 80s or the 90s or in the early 2000s. Barring countries like, say, Indonesia or Malaysia, where you have a very large Muslim population, many of these countries, including Cambodia, Vietnam, Singapore, they have come out with some very, I would say, calculated or very careful viewpoints about what's happening in Gaza Strip, or condemning what Israel's, if I may say, like Israel's reactions against the Hamas or use of force. But for now, what could be, there are, of course, various experts from the region and particularly from Israel who would be able to tell more. But from a little bit of my reading, that of course there are continuation of the communications, there are continuation of the diplomatic ties, and it is unlike 1973 war when you have various countries snapping ties with Israel after the oil embargo. That in itself talks about how things have changed politically and diplomatically for Israel. It has been a big success. But when it comes to the sort of trade that you referred to, the defense, it might slow down for a while, but that is not to say that it is going to be completely stopped. So there are also certain domestic politics which these countries have to be a little mindful about if there are going to be a lot more pressure coming in internally. So that has been, even with India also, that has been the case. Like, the domestic politics was one major factor that had not allowed our government in the past to come out very openly in support of our relationships with Israel, which was heavily dominated by defense trade. But Israel would not like to lose out on a market like Southeast Asian markets, particularly those countries that I've referred to. So it's just a matter of time that they will have to wait and see. But I still feel that the Israeli arms sales or the military defense cooperation with the region will continue to survive.
That is a very lengthy and a very understanding explanations of the whole trade which is going on between Southeast Asia, Asian nations, and Israel and the region as a whole. But now the question is directed to Professor Colin. Ever since Hamas has launched an offensive against Israel and its territory, the situation has generally worsened, and today is also a day of an unprecedented attack on Israel. So what exactly do you think that the role can the regional actors and the extraterritorial powers can play in this specific conflict?
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. As the last speaker mentioned, there has been no breaking off of diplomatic ties with various Arab states, which I think is important. They may be critical, they may be harshly critical, but they haven't broken off diplomatic ties. And at the basis of that, there's a sense that Israel, like them, has a common interest, a commonality in opposing Iran, not least Saudi Arabia, which, of course, has no, at least open or formal diplomatic relations with Israel, but certainly there are relations. It's also worth mentioning that at the very start of this year-long war, this year-long crisis, the United Arab Emirates tried very, very hard, the United Nations, over a period of weeks to bring together Israel and to find a way out of this maze, this political maze. And the UAE failed quite a lot. Have there been other actors in this? Well, in last week's attack by the Iranians on Israel, Jordan was certainly involved in the defense of Israel. Now, so that suggests that there is a common, perhaps if unwritten alliance between Israel and many of the Arab states. Many of the Arab states, well, some of the Arab states, let me put it more accurately, some of the Arab states like Bahrain have a sizable Shiite minority, and therefore they are concerned about Iranian influence in their country, and that's another factor which is to be taken into consideration. Now, you mentioned, how did you put it, extraterritorial powers. Now, in a sense, in the wider world, there have been mass demonstrations here in London every Saturday. I think the first demonstration, there were hundreds of thousands of people who marched. And I think, as Thomas inferred, the far left has had more interest in October the 8th than indeed October the 7th. They were stymied about what their reaction should be. They were moored in indecision on the 7th of October. How could they indeed criticize Hamas. And this in itself was a factor in the alliance between the far left globally and Islamists. I'm not talking about 19th century Islamic reformers, but I'm talking about the Islamists of the 1970s and onwards. The fact that Hamas was always a front for the Muslim Brotherhood is never mentioned. So you have that. In addition, there have been Muslim communities worldwide, not only been mobilized by the far left, but of course there's a basis for that, in that they've been horrified in seeing the destruction of Gaza. The Hamas-controlled Ministry of Health quotes the figure of 42,000 people killed. Even if you have half of that, it still suggests that thousands of people, men, women, and children who are not combatants have been killed. Now, can you justify this? Hamas, Islamic Jihad, have embedded themselves within the structure, the infrastructure of Gaza. And therefore, the question is, how, if you wish to fight them, how do you extract them? And this is very much a moral dilemma. Muslim communities watch the BBC in England, and the focus is on the destruction of Gaza. So they will say, for example, that Israel attacked a school, all right? But they attacked a school in the sense that people believe that there are children in there, that there are teachers in there, that it's a school in the normative understanding of that term. But the Israeli understanding of that would be that there were Hamas storage of weapons there. So this complexity is never actually projected. And so we find that in England, there's something like 5 members of parliament were returned, standing as independents recently, because they stood on the Gaza ticket. And Muslim community, something like 1/3 of them moved away from Labour and voted for them, and 5 were elected on a primarily Gaza ticket. So we have that situation. I'd like to say that there's the fundamental difference between Lebanon and Gaza, in that Gaza was the place where the hostages were taken. And I think Israeli society, the Israeli electorate is almost certainly behind the attack on Hezbollah and the incursion into Lebanon, but they are divided about Gaza. Netanyahu has promised total victory, and there's it depends on what is the priority. Is the priority retrieving, rescuing the hostages, or is it destroying Hamas? And that is the binary, the fundamental choice. The last release of hostages was in November 2023. Since then, virtually, I think 1 or 2 maybe, virtually no one has come back. It is quite possible that many of the hostages are dead, and many of the hostages have been put in inhumane conditions in Gaza. Some have been murdered by their captors. But in Israel itself, you have to decide, are you on the side of the government, or are you on the side of the hostages' families? Hostages' families have been calling for a ceasefire since January. And there have been plans, the Biden plan, even the Hamas put forward its conditions on the 10th of September. And it seems that Netanyahu is prevaricating all the way through. And of course, he has much to lose if a deal is struck with Hamas, not least the failure of his the falling apart of his coalition. The final point I'd like to make is this. The military prowess of the IDF in the past few weeks in killing the head of Hezbollah and decapitating the leadership of Hezbollah. And of course, this has impressed the Israeli electorate. However, according to the latest opinion polls, Likud gain 4 or 5 extra seats, but they still do not have enough, this present coalition, to form a government. So if there was an election tomorrow morning, Netanyahu's coalition would fail miserably, and the opposition, led by Gantz or possibly by a return by Bennett, would win the election. And that is something that Netanyahu cannot risk at the moment, and also it underpins his strategy in this terrible war. Thank you.
So you talked about political risks and the risks associated with it. But now let's bring into the considerations of India. And this particular questions will be directed to Ms. Nina. With the raging conflict, especially in West Asia, Israel continues to grapple with the ongoing war in Gaza, given its clashes with Hamas in the first instance, now it's Hezbollah. What are the potential opportunities for strengthening defense and counterterrorism relations between India and Israel in such a context?
So first of all, thank you for having me. I would like to say that, first of all, the relations between India and Israel are strategic. Both countries are collaborating on a wide range of sectors, including defense and security. What is important to understand is that both countries started to collaborate on these sectors way before they normalized their relations in 1992. We're talking about the times during the Cold War when India was attacked by hostile neighboring countries, naming China in 1962 and Pakistan in 1965 and 1971, where there were no relations between both countries. Israel was one of the only countries which decided to invade India in difficult times. Afterwards, when both countries normalized their relations, the defense and security relations extended in the beginning of the 21st century, following the nuclear tests that both India and Pakistan conducted in 1998. And when India and Pakistan were isolated from many countries in the world, and India had to conduct a border war with Pakistan during the Kargil War of 1999. The only country that was ready to help India in this war was Israel. And then in recent years, the relations under the leadership of Prime Minister Narendra Modi continue to extend in these sectors as well. Now, in this war, Israel had a lot of successes and failures. Then both India and Israel could learn from and collaborate in understanding how to address threats that are coming from state and non-state actors in West Asia and other regions in the world. And what is interesting to see is how upgraded armaments will be developed in the next future, considering new threats that are coming from state and non-state actors in the region, and what both countries could learn and could collaborate in these sectors in potential threats that can come from West Asia and South Asia as well. So I believe that the relations, whether they will be publicly put or publicly developed behind the curtains, will continue to extend in these regards.
So that's a very interesting insights about, you talked about public policy, you also touched a bit about the strategic nature of the relations out of it. So I'll come to Dr. Tomar. Given the Israel's historical struggle for identity and especially its homeland, considering the geopolitical dynamics of the present period, what exactly the strategic approach that Israel can adopt with regard to resolving the current conflict and also ensuring the long-term stability and peace in the region?
Thank you. Maybe I'll comment first about what you ask about identity and our struggle for our homeland. This year, I taught a short course in OP Jindal Global University in near Delhi, and I told the students there that I think they need to understand what we mean by a struggle for homeland when we are Israeli. India has been where it is for the last 5,000 years, and it will be there for the next 5,000 years. There's no question about it. It has difficulties, it has challenges, but you don't have a question of being a part of being on your homeland, enjoying your homeland, perhaps with more or less security, but it's still there's no question about India going away somewhere. There is a question about Israel's survival, right? There is a question about if the state of Israel will be there in 20, 50, 100 years. It's a question that burns in every Israeli's mind. And we as Jews were not on our homeland for the last 2,000 years, right? Apart from a few. My own grandparents were refugees. My own grandparents fled from the Nazis and came to Israel in 1948 with nothing, basically, right? So just understand the context that we are talking about when we're talking about a struggle for a homeland and a Jewish identity, and understand on that background what the attack of the 7th of October last year did to Israeli identity and to Jewish identity. Basically, it brought a very big crack to the heart of it, right? A crack in the sense of security, in the sense of stability, in the sense that there are challenges again, but nothing serious is threatening us. So this is the context that we are talking from within. Now, that doesn't excuse what I think the mistakes of Israel are right now in perhaps in Gaza, perhaps overreacting, again, not laying out any clear strategy that spells a certain endpoint to the war, what Israel is even trying to achieve. And if you are asking about a strategy that when we look to the future can guarantee or at least support some sense of security for Israel, I think that strategy has to have within it, not as the only component, but within it has to have a horizon in which the Israelis and the Palestinians, or the Jews and the Palestinians, are separated and have each their own state or something that resembles a state, right? To be, to give some leeway. Israel cannot imagine and cannot pretend to be able to occupy militarily millions of people indefinitely, right? I'm not going to give any excuses for the Palestinian liberation movement, which is, I think in world history will not be a part of the runners up in exemplary behavior and strategic thinking. Our neighbors are not the best people to agree on something, but again, that's no excuse for Israel not being able today even to say, yes, at some point in the future, we will cease to militarily control millions of people. It can't even say that because our prime minister, as Professor Shindler has said, is caught up in his coalition interests, cannot, and is dependent totally on his religious fundamentalist partners in coalition, and cannot even articulate, it cannot even lie about it. Not that I support lying, but he cannot even do that. So any program, any strategy that when we look at the future that can give Israel a place in the Middle East, not to mention relations and and the covenants and agreements with its neighbors and the Emirates and Saudi Arabia has to include within it some sort of separation between Israel and Palestine and some sort of independence or self-determination for the Palestinian people. I think without that, the situation will continue to deteriorate.
So I will direct one specific question which is very close to my heart with regard to intelligence officers and Israeli intelligence officers. It's like, what exactly do you think the reforms is necessary to ensure accountability and effectiveness in intelligence operations, especially following high stakes in incidences like the Iran Vault operation? This particular question is directed to Dr. Freilich because based on your experiences in the services.
Well, what reforms are needed, I think, is something that is still being explored by the intelligence agencies themselves, and there will be a need to establish a commission of national inquiry to try and assess really what the failures were and what has to be done. So let me leave it to them to assess that, other than to say that clearly Israel was caught totally by surprise on October 7th. The intelligence agencies were guilty of making every possible mistake. This was, I think, like other major intelligence failures in history, Pearl Harbor, the Yom Kippur War, 9/11, Barbarossa. In the end, it's a failure of imagination because no one in Israel believed that Hamas had the capability to do anything vaguely similar to what it succeeded in doing. And so when there was discrepant information that didn't fit with that mindset, and there was, remarkably, the military intelligence had gotten its hands on Hamas's entire war plan a year before the war. It doesn't usually get better. You don't get that from the enemy usually. But it was ignored because everybody thought, all right, it's just dreaming. And there is, of course, the always important, but here particularly important, relationship between politics and society and a defense establishment generally, specifically in intelligence, in the sense that 2023 was the year of the so-called judicial reform in Israel that the government initiated. I call it the judicial coup or the judicial wrecking ball. And in point of fact, in last October, as amazing as this may sound, Israel's defense establishment was fighting simply to keep itself together because the country was being torn apart by the judicial reform process. People were refusing to serve the government under those circumstances, serve in reserve duty. The army and the intelligence agencies were simply on the verge of coming apart. And to give you one example, the Mossad, for the first time in its history, gave its employees the permission to participate in public protests, which is something that they had never been allowed to do in the past because it wants to be such a non-political organization. But here, employees simply wouldn't have accepted that. And so I think those are a couple of the big lessons. Israel's going to have to, of course, adopt a somewhat more aggressive or offensive approach, is a better term, in the future. Maintain a larger military force in general and specifically on the alert. And the intelligence agencies will have to be on a higher state of alert, weighing potential dangers with greater suspicion, should I call it. There's always the balance between, do you assess the enemy's intentions or the enemy's capabilities? Now, if you go by their intentions, then Israel should be on full maximum alert 24/7 all the time, because if we listen to what our enemies say, then they are in a perpetual war for Israel's destruction. Do they have the capabilities? Usually no. So you can't really invest all the time to deal with intentions. If you don't have enough to deal with capabilities, that's also not sufficient, as we saw, and there's an ongoing tension between the two considerations.
Especially when we talk about especially media coverage and domestic and international on an international basis, We have seen live in the show itself that there are rockets flowing. So in this respect, I would ask one last question to you. How do you think media coverage, both international and domestic, can influence public perceptions with regard to the existential crisis that Israel is facing, and with regard to how it can affect national security policy of Israel in the long run?
Well, I think that's a very good and painful question, because the media don't just reflect reality, they create reality. And when you focus entirely on what is a much easier picture to present, which is human suffering, and warfare is heinous. No matter how justified it is always heinous. And after the first, let's say, literally few days when after October 7th, when Israel enjoyed vast international sympathy, then the picture switched, and the sympathy turns towards the Palestinian civilians. Now, of course, no one wants to see civilians hurt, and I would certainly be the last among them. But who in the end is responsible for this suffering? Is it Israel, which is fighting to protect itself? Or is it Hamas, which started the war? Hamas, which put all of its military capabilities among its civilian population, using them as human shields, and actually wanting Israel to attack them, because the more civilian casualties they suffer, the greater the international sympathy. And here I think there's a problem that the media have to address, because I don't think they're really telling the picture. And they've also continued to this day to speak of the war. Now, the war, as far as I'm concerned, ended in January. There's been ongoing fighting ever since. Most of it has been low level, of the kind of counterterrorism operations of the kind that will probably have to continue for years to come. And yes, there were a couple of spikes when Israel went into Rafah, into Khan Yunis, and in recent days in Jabalia. But those have been exceptions. The war per se ended then. They're not telling that story. They're not telling the story that Hamas is continuing to fire rockets. Just yesterday, this morning, half a dozen rockets. The focus is entirely on Gazan suffering. I think that has to change. And that reminds me of one last comment apropos your question before about the normative aspect of the war, about the number of casualties. So yes, Hamas's health service, the Gazan health ministry, says 42,000 people have been killed. Let's assume that that number is reasonably accurate. But almost half of them, well over a third in any event, are undoubtedly Hamas fighters, and probably many more. And then the line that the media love to use is that mostly women and children. Well, Gaza, because of its huge population explosion, over 40% of the population are under the age of 14, and about 50% are under the age of 18. So just statistically, you're going to hit mostly children and women. And by the way, male deaths aren't particularly attractive either. So I think, again, there's a question of how these things are presented, how they're framed. I believe that at least in the West, there is an entire generation of mostly the young people, the young reporters, the young producers behind the scenes, who have grown up in an era when Israel has been vilified endlessly in a one-sided way. And by the way, I've got a great deal of criticism for some of our policies as well. But these are people who have forgotten the fundamental story, or don't know it because that's not what they were taught, that Israel is fighting for its existence against genocidal neighbors.
So you are dropping the fundamental questions of an existential crisis and the whole concept regarding state survival. So based on that, I will right now ask a question to Dr. Colin. In between the war in the Middle East, there were several nations that were trying to initiate negotiations and talks between Israel and Hamas. With the conflict elevating further, how do you assess the internal political environment of Israel, and given the current government is going strong to its agenda to eliminate Hamas? And how does this affect the regional geopolitics as a whole?
Well, I think, as I suggested, the government of Netanyahu and the far right is it's like a pantomime horse, except it has more than two heads as well. And Netanyahu knows that if he strikes a deal, if he shows any signs of coming to the negotiating table, then his government falls apart. And as I suggested before, if there are elections tomorrow morning, the present government, present coalition, would not win. It would be a different government, which would have a different policy. So, and also Netanyahu, as you know, is on trial for all sorts of misdemeanors. So he's not going to take the chance. The longer he can drag this out, the longer he can prevaricate. It's in his interests, his personal interests, but not the national interests of Israel to do so. It was mentioned before about two states. If you look at it historically, the Jewish national movement and the Arab national movement arose at approximately the same time in history, with claims over the same territory. The logic of that, and it's a simplistic logic, is that the land should be divided, and therefore there should be a two-state solution. And of course, most people say at the moment that it's, pie in the sky, it's far away, it's an impossible dream. And yet you have people like Ehud Olmert and Al-Kidwa, Israeli and a Palestinian, coming up with proposals based on the Annapolis proposals of 2008, certainly. That's still very important. We've spoken about the strategy of the Netanyahu coalition in the actions it's taken in Gaza. A few weeks ago, Naftali Bennett, who I presume is trying to make a political comeback, was on one of the US television stations, and he suggested that rather than go into urban areas, there should be quick and sharp entries by obviously IDF special units, and then withdraw. They shouldn't be attacking specific locations in Gaza. He suggested also that food should go in, but he suggested that fuel should not. So whether this is viable or feasible is another question. But the point is there are parallel strategies for resolving this question. It may be late in the day to suggest this now, but certainly there are people like Bennett who are proposing them. Now, of course, Bennett has a political motivation in doing so if he wishes to stand at the head of a new party in any forthcoming elections. So there's all of that. The other point that I'd make is that Netanyahu refers quite a lot to his forebears in terms of Jewish history, etc. I don't think he understands Jewish history. I think he quotes from it. He lauds Vladimir Jabotinsky, who was the founder of the revisionist Zionists, which was the forerunner of the Likud. This was founded in Paris in 1925. Jabotinsky may have told people, learn to shoot, but it was designed to impress and to strengthen mentally and psychologically Jews that were oppressed in Eastern Europe during the interwar years. He never suggested military action in a real sense. Netanyahu actually owes the legacy of his views to the maximalist wing of the revisionist movement, people like Abba Achimeya. And Achimeya was a great admirer of Mussolini's Italy. This is where I think Netanyahu's views come from. Even in the 1990s, he spoke about reciprocity in order to basically undermine the Oslo Accords, that if you do something, we will respond. And I think this dogma, this mantra, has effectively derailed any diplomatic efforts. The idea that is there a role for diplomacy? Well, yes, of course, there's always a role for diplomacy, but it hasn't worked so far, and we're a year into this. Diplomacy just has not worked. So even the most reasonable of proposals that have been put forward to retrieve the hostages, as Netanyahu has said, yes, that's very interesting. I'll have to discuss it. And then there's this long drawn out scenario with eventually nothing happening. And this is the practice. The final point I'd like to make, Chuck mentioned the media. I was always a great fan of the BBC. I always thought they were objective. I thought they were fair. It's, to use an English phrase, it's cricket, right? Everything was fair and just, etc., and balanced. I don't believe that anymore. I listened to the Today program from 6 in the morning to 9, also in the morning, and it was usually very, very good, but I found it superficial. The analysis is out of context. Israel's dilemmas, Israel's complexity is hardly mentioned. There's an imbalance in the BBC's approach. And I'm convinced, as Chuck implied, that it is this that has influenced many young people in particular in England. For the Muslim community, there's nearly 4 million Muslims in England. It has been an assertion of Muslim identity. And that's often based on a lack of knowledge, a lack of understanding of history, why Israel came into existence. And Zionism, which started, in my view, with the French Revolution, has now become a code word for a racist slur. And this is the scenario we're in now. And there's no end game, there's no solution, there's no light at the end of the tunnel. And this is where we are at the moment.
So that is one of the insightful answers that you gave us. I hope, Ms. Nina, you were doing safe. With regard to the recent developments and the risk stagnations and the conflict which is right now seeming to be live from across India and Israel and across the world, how do you perceive the I2U2 forum, which is involving India, Israel, UAE, and the United States, which is currently facing hurdles as the Arab nations are facing rising domestic tensions with negative implications for the forum? Given the prevailing scenario, what are the essential strategies can Israel and India adopt to enhance connectivity and ensure risk stagnations by maintaining their independent public positions in the conflict?
So the main purpose of I2U2 was to forge an alliance following the Abraham Accords that were signed in 2020. And these kinds of alliance did not focus only on defense and security issues, as many people and countries believed, but the main aspect of human security was put in the center. By human security, we mean healthcare, food security, financial security, all these kinds of things that can assure that a person could live a decent life. Now, West Asia is a combustible region. We see that there are wars that erupt and different crises, natural disasters, and also the pandemic that touched the entire world. And countries should come together and think how they could maintain connectivity and supply chain intact when a certain crisis is occurring in a certain region. When maritime, land, and air routes and passages are blocked or bombarded by different countries or non-state actors, as the Houthis in Yemen, for instance, blocked the Red Sea, or Iran decided to just attack 2 times Israel with ballistic and cruise missiles, or where Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, and Shiite militias in Syria and Iraq are blocking air route and land route as well. So I think that countries should come together and understand how they could assure not only the connectivity between countries, but also how to assure safe passage of people and goods to different countries. Because we live today in a globalized era when countries are interconnected to one another. And when there is a crisis that erupts in a certain country, other countries that might not be in the same region could be affected very badly. So what is interesting is to think together how this kind of connectivity and supply chain cannot be interrupted. Now, India conducts a multi-aligned approach when it comes to its foreign policy. And for many years, it conducted a policy in which it has good relations with different countries, including West Asia, that might have a certain a degree of hostility between them. If we're talking about West Asia, we can think about India's having good relations with Saudi Arabia and Iran, Israel and the Palestinian Authority, and other countries that are currently in a conflict. So there were many commentators and many people that thought that maybe India could play a mediator role in the current conflict in Israel and West Asia. But my humble opinion is that India will wait and see how things will develop, because we see a constant escalation and different developments that are ongoing as we speak. So I think that maybe India will try to call, and as it did recently, for restraint from all the countries in West Asia, and we try to find pragmatic Arab countries that could also de-escalate the conflicts. But for now, it's very difficult to discuss about a de-escalation when Israel is still bombarded. And just now, when we are talking in this webinar, I was compelled to go to shelter because my town was bombarded by a missile that comes from Yemen. So I think that India is not only a rising power, but a country that could play an important role in forging good relations, not only on the bilateral level, but also on the multilateral level, and bring all these kinds of alliances, as the I2U2 alliances and other positive developments that occurred following the Abraham Accords into a proactive approach, and finding the right partners who will be able to assure the human security aspect of life.
So I would like to ask you another questions with regard as we delve into the hours of 7th of October and the recent incident which has happened. The conflict has never seemed to be much live as possible. The India's Prime Minister was among the first among the world leaders to express solidarity with Israel. Immediately afterwards, India abstained from its use at the United Nations General Assembly and also towards an international arms embargo on Israel. Given the current actions, how do you think that India can affect regional geopolitics in the Middle East and Israel's broader diplomatic strategy in the region?
So I believe that India will continue to promote its multi-aligned approach, or as it's called, its strategic autonomy, to conduct a de-hyphenated approach when it deals separately with each and every country in West Asia, including Israel, the Palestinian Authority, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the Gulf countries, in order to see and try to see how it can bring to the de-escalation of the current situation in West Asia. However, India is, as I said, it is embodied in its political culture to just wait and see how things will develop before changing its policy or taking a more proactive approach in a certain aspect of the current conflict. But I think it will continue to support Israel in its war on terror, because India, unfortunately, is also a victim of terror. And I think that India will be able to discuss with Gulf countries, with Saudi Arabia, and other countries in West Asia that understand the current situation, the threats that Israel should address to restore peace and stability in the region, especially stability for now, and to collaborate closely with these countries in order to find ways, whether it will be in back channels or it will not be publicly published and put forward. But I think that India has the power to discuss with all sides, as it did, for instance, in the current crisis in Ukraine, when India was able to discuss not only with Russia but also with Ukraine in order to see possibilities, different possibilities to de-escalate the situation between both countries, with whom India has good relations. So I believe that India will be more and more involved in the region, will try to promote different projects such as the IMEC project, the India Middle East European corridor, that wanted to promote this kind of connectivity and bridges between countries, which will bring prosperity to all countries that will be part of these kinds of projects. But unfortunately, there are state and non-state actors who are part of the axis of terror added by Iran that are not willing to see these kind of positive developments in the region, because they believe them to undermine their power and their hegemonic aspirations.
So that is an insightful aspect that you have brought into this whole conflict, especially when we talk about infrastructure and risk mitigations. But right now, I'd like to move to Dr. Alvite. With the growing conflict in Israel and Hamas, the negative implications has extended beyond West Asia. It is very true for the African nations, which is still grappling with the political economic consequences of the conflict. The presence of terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda and radical Islamic organizations in those locations exploits the Gaza conflict. So under such a context, do you think the conflict can contribute to further radicalization in South Africa because of the presence of such organizations in the region?
Thank you, Anirban, for that question again. See, when it comes to the issue of radicalization, this is not something new which we are seeing in the region. There are various actors that would try to take chance of opportunity of what's going on in West Asia or in the Middle East to use it as a kind of a point to prop up more radicalization process, not only in the region but also in different parts of the world. We have seen that during the heyday of groups like ISIS, Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, how they would like to make use of some of these developments, say in Syria or in Gaza Strip or in in the parts of West Bank, or even for that matter in Jammu and Kashmir, the sufferings of the Muslims as one of the reasons to increase the rate of radicalization in different parts of the world. That probably could fit in more to this entire phenomenon of radicalization in different parts of the world. One would take advantage of what's happening in the region and to to give more energy to that kind of a very pernicious ideology, which is being promoted by groups like Al Qaeda or various other terror organizations or extremist groups, not only in the Middle East but also in Africa. So that is something which even countries like India have to be a little mindful about. We are increasingly seeing a phenomenon of the transnational terrorism, where ideas flow from one country to another country very rapidly and try to use some developments in other parts of the world, connecting with what's happening in different parts of the world again. So we have seen that example, the cases very visibly between 2014, 16, 17, during the heights of groups like ISIS. You have seen we have seen that in Southeast and South Asian country as well. So one has to be. That's when what Nina had just mentioned about what India and Israel can also do in this regard. That would also give us a lot of food for thought to enhance our cooperation in the counterterrorism sector. Particularly in the realms of counter-radicalization or de-radicalization, and that's when the cybersecurity, intelligence sharing, information sharing would come into use. But one has to be a little mindful, because now we have seen many of these groups, particularly look at what's happening with Hezbollah and what's happening with Hamas. Many of their top leaderships have been eliminated, and so this would give some kind of, in my opinion, this would kind of encourage the other terror organizations to use to kind of fill up the vacuum in terms of raising their profile in the region and elsewhere, and talk about the Palestinian cause. So there's a high possibility of this sort of a phenomenon getting on the rise again. So one has to be extremely mindful about it.
Which we usually, when we talk about the presence of such organizations, it really creates a doctrine of an ideological rhetoric and the relations and the conflicts surrounding it. But I will come to Dr. Tomar for a last questions in this panel. The ideological narratives remain at the forefront of ever-changing public discourse concerning Israel and Gaza. Like with the spread of internet and social media, politically polarized memes and other forms of mass content generations are affecting the younger generation, specifically those very young. Under the given circumstances, what are the essential steps that can the public policy and the public diplomacy practitioners can adopt to nurture a sense of conflict mitigations against the prevailing ideological rhetoric, which is spreading rapidly in West Asia?
Right. Thank you. I think we first need to differentiate between different currents in these ideological narratives. And let me very simplistically divide them into three. I think on the right side, on the extreme right, we have, basic people, sort of white supremacist groups who are both Islamophobic and sometimes anti-Semitic. And there's no real reason to engage them, and there's no real point in discussing things with them, right? In the middle, in the very wide part of the middle of the political and ideological narrative field, we have both on the right and the left basic liberal protagonists. They can be more conservative or more progressive, but they adhere to the basic ethos of the Enlightenment liberal values, meaning equality, freedom, human rights, etc. For these people, I want to return to what I said before. If Israel is able to articulate some sort of future, some sort of horizon in which the rights of everybody are respected, in which there is some sort of equality between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, in which every nation gets its chance at self-determination, even if not now, but a horizon of such a future, right? We are progressing towards. I think that will solve much of the problem with that public. And then we can argue on the specifics, but really this is in general what we need to do. Now, on the far left, we've got the radical left wing, which I think, when we talk about the outburst of demonstrations happening already on the 8th of October against Israel, these are the people that we're talking about. And they are fed with a conglomeration of post-colonial thought, of post-national sentiment, and I would say at the base of even of very simple antagonism towards the West. These are Westerners who feel that the West has grievously sinned against the East, against non-white people, against non-Western cultures, by colonialism, by capitalism, etc. Right? And this is, we recognize this post-colonial narrative. With these people, I would say two things. First of all, this is not only Israel's problem. This is a Western problem. Western universities today are informing their students that there is something fundamentally wrong with the West. I think that's wrong. There's nothing fundamentally wrong with the West. I think liberalism and the Enlightened values are good. And while the West has obviously sinned and has been complicit in numerous and negative actions towards other peoples, there's nothing again inherently wrong with it, and we need to fix what's wrong. And so this is a problem with elite universities in the West in general. Now, for Israel, it has a special angle to it in which sometimes anti-Semitism also is involved, and at all times in general there is a very harsh criticism against Israel as being a symbolic epitome, a symbolic totem of the West within the East, right? Within what we call the Middle East, what you will call the Near West, right? But for Westerners, this is a sort of a Western bastion within the Arab world, the Eastern Muslim, etc. world. And for them, that's offensive in itself, right? So Israel has to contend with anti-Western, antagonism towards the West, anti-Western thought coming from the West, concentrating on Israel as a symbolically Western fortress within the East. I think, again, the way to do it is, first of all, get the liberals on your side, get both the progressive and the conservative liberals on your side by offering some sort of liberal horizon in this region for the future. And then again, cooperating with Western forces that also feel understand the problematics of these narratives today prevalent in elite universities, etc., and trying to figure out how to counter them. But these will be the avenues, I think, to be taken.
That was basically, we're talking about ideological narratives and the public discourse as a whole. But as we come across the end of this particular panel discussions, we have discussed a lot about strategy, we have discussed a bit about public diplomacy, ideology, and especially Israel's relationship with Asian countries and across the world. To say so, this was a very interesting panel, and thank you for accepting our invitations and coming to our panel discussions. And I'm also glad to announce that the Center for Strategic Studies has just released a new report quoting From the Horrors of October 7 to the Eliminations of Terror. So this is a brand new report which focuses on the interrelationship between Jews and the Arabs, and what exactly the events that have panned out since the October 7th attack on Israel in 2023. So thank you, everyone, and good wishes to all the panelists.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Shana Tova.